here respected. Expert level information, entertainment, education. Rev Yearwood got you covered as you hit your destination. Climate rules everything around me. Cream. For those who lost focus, close your eyes and just dream. Open your third eye, now the world is your office. Coolest show you know is the Hip Hop Caucus.
Hi everyone, welcome back to The Coolest Show. I'm Destiny Hodges, one of the show's producers, and in this episode, we'll be hearing part 2 of our episodes on urban greening. We'll be hearing from folks in LA, including Sissy Trinh, the Executive Director of Southeast Asian Community Alliance, and Dr. Manuel Pastor, the Director at USC Equity Research Institute. Sissy Trinh, the Executive Director of Southeast Asian Community Alliance, introduced us to her, the org, and challenges faced when doing community revitalization.
My name is Sissy Trinh. I'm the Executive Director of SEACA, the Southeast Asian Community Alliance, and we're based in Los Angeles. So we work on youth organizing and policy advocacy, specifically to look at how do we create neighborhoods that are economically and environmentally sustainable. Chinatown's one of the poorest neighborhoods in the city, and what we've been seeing is a lot of climate investments have actually led to a lot of real estate speculation. And so what we're trying to figure out is how do we say yes to the good stuff? More parks, cleaner neighborhoods, better air quality, but make sure that all of those good investments don't lead to increased displacement, gentrification, and for many of our tenants, homelessness. So the US over the next 10 to 20 years is going to be spending trillions of dollars in urban greening, climate infrastructure, right? Making neighborhoods more resilient to extreme heat events and extreme, climate events, but also just to make them, greener for the future. That's a lot of money that could be going to real estate speculators, to major corporations that already have plenty of money, or it could be an opportunity to provide good jobs for people who are struggling to find decent employment, and it could also provide infrastructure for community.
Sissy shared with us how to get people involved in caring about urban greening, as well as how her community is receiving the issue.
So a lot of times when government agency staff, city planners, and landscape architects come into a neighborhood and ask people about what kind of park do they want, what kind of design features, they don't really think about who lives here and how they use the park. Not in the way that we do as an organization that is here every day, works with residents who come to the park every day and understand the multitude of uses that a park has for these types of communities, right? Because, and so oftentimes when we ask people, what do they want? We don't just ask them, do you want a park or not? Because nobody's gonna say no, right? But we wanna think about how different populations use parks, right? A teenage boy is gonna have a very different idea for what he wants to see in a park than a low-income senior who's mobility challenged. I will be honest with you, urban greening is not even top 10 on people's lists of important issues. We have a lot of families that are making less than minimum wage, one rent increase away from becoming homeless. There are a lot more urgent issues. I think for us, when we talk about urban greening, it is in the context of what are the opportunities to address other issues and other needs and priorities in the communities, right? So urban greening is an opportunity to get living wage jobs, right, into low-income communities. It is an opportunity to address day-to-day needs, right? So for example, like I said, our parks and our libraries are used by a lot of low-income seniors who can't afford heat or air conditioning, right? For them, if they were to spend money on heat during the winters or air conditioning in the summers when it's 100, 105 degrees, that's money that they need for rent, right? And if they're skipping meals for rent, why would they spend money on air conditioning and heat? So they go to the library, they go to the park to get heat or to escape, to get AC. That's important infrastructure. And so we think, talking to them about how to use these public spaces in a way that, again, can support other needs and programs and services. And so one of the programs that we're running is we've been partnering with the Chinatown Library to do food distribution out of the library, and then also COVID testing kits. So we used to distribute to individual households, and now we just go to the library and give them boxes, and then people can just pick them up whenever they want. So it's easier for us. It's easier for, it's great for the library because people are asking and they didn't know where to get them, and now we just deliver it to them, And so again, like, green spaces are community infrastructure. It's just, how do we rethink them so that it's not just about recreation and nature, and more about how does it help us live and survive in challenging times and then thrive in better times.
We asked Dr. Manuel Pastor to share with us who he is and how he got started in this work.
Manuel Pastor, I'm the director of the Equity Research Institute at USC. We do a lot of work on environmental and climate justice and a bunch of other issues of racial, economic justice. Well, I'm a working class Latino kid who grew up in La Puente, which is a town east of East LA. We were surrounded by freeways and pollution and auto yards, and I guess in a way the sort of impact of environmental injustice, I felt it in my own life. And I got involved in thinking about issues of racial and economic justice in the late 60s and the early 70s, a time when everything seemed at stake, like really everything seems at stake today. So the journey into doing the work and the research around environmental justice is pretty natural. I kind of came to it as a researcher in the 1990s when community groups in South and East LA approached me and colleagues about whether or not we could help to document the disparities that they were facing, whether we could work with them on what sort of tools would be needed to change conditions, and also the kind of information that would be crucial for the policy campaigns. And since the 1990s, it's the work I've been doing.
We asked Dr. Pastor about the intersections between climate justice and environmental justice, as well as the role of his community in the fight and urban greening.
Well, one of the things that's important to realize is that there's climate justice and environmental justice. When we talk about environmental justice, it's often a little bit more broad than the climate. The climate has to do with the changing weather, the way in which really weather conditions have become completely unpredictable. There can be both droughts and floods at the same time. And the communities that are the most at risk from that are communities that have been marginalized socially and economically. And that's low-income communities and communities of color that are at risk from wildfire, from flooding, etc. Environmental justice is a little more broad. It has to do with exposures to all sorts of hazards, proximity to places that transfer, store, dispose of hazardous wastes, proximity to freeways and ports and refineries. And one of the things we know from the research is that while income is important in that, it's true that it's more low-income communities that face the most risks. It's actually race that matters even more than income. And that's because of the history of redlining, the history of citing of hazards in in communities of color, etc. The political power that is there because of white supremacy on the one hand and communities of color lacking political power on the other. So one of the things the research tells us is that when you're looking at both climate risk and just environmental risk more generally, that it is race that matters even more than income. And that's one of the reasons why this is an issue that is so important to have a racial perspective on, so important to be organizing communities of color on, and so important to be building ties between communities of color. When you look at the research, it's Black communities that are often the most exposed, but Latino communities are not far behind, and Asian communities are also the most exposed, particularly when you're controlling for income levels. And so this is really one of those natural issues to build ties between communities of color. The other thing that I think is really, really crucial here is to realize that just as climate change is real, so is the climate gap. That is, the differences in exposure and risk faced by communities of color. And that another part of that climate gap, which most people don't pay attention to, is if you look at the polling data on who cares the most about climate change, is in the state of California, there's a poll that's been running for about 20 years. And that poll tells us consistently that it's Black, Latino, Californians that actually care more about climate and climate change than white Californians. Why? Because they're the most at risk from climate change, most likely to be experiencing this not just as climate change, but as the actual health impacts, asthma, etc., from living next to a refinery or a freeway, when we know that mobile sources are the biggest generator of greenhouse gas emissions, which affect climate change. So one of the things we know from our research is that if you're looking at the difference between communities that have a tree canopy and shade versus the communities that overwhelmingly have impervious surface like asphalt and concrete, that difference in every region in the state of California is very sharp by race. That is, the higher the percent people of color in a community, the more likely it is to have less tree canopy, and the more likely it is to have more impervious surface like asphalt. I mean, I know this growing up in La Puente, where I grew up. My fondest summertime memories are walking across vast stretches of asphalt and feeling it sink below my feet and not realizing that actually is a heat island. That what that means is that as the planet warms, while that affects everyone generally, if you're living near the coast of California and you've got a lot of trees around you, you have a little bit of a shielding effect from the greenery in your urban area. But if you're living in South Los Angeles, if you're living in Pacoima, if you're living in East Los Angeles, you're much less likely to have trees. You're much more likely to have impervious surface. You're much more likely to be part of an urban heat island, so that as the Los Angeles generally warms up, you're the one that's going to be at the most risk when there is a heat wave in Southern California. Los Angeles, we became majority people of color in 1988, about a decade before the state of California did, and that's about 45 years before the rest of the United States did. So we were sort of America fast forward, and in Los Angeles, kind of America on steroids. We're also on steroids in terms of the level of urban inequality, the gap between the wealthy and the poor here. But we've actually also been a little bit of America fast forward in terms of environmental justice organizing and the shift within environmental justice from not just documenting hazards, but trying to figure out what we can do about them that will make for a better life for our people. How we can do urban greening and bring trees to communities, how we can declare green zones in South Los Angeles and Wilmington and East LA and in the San Fernando Valley, Pacoima in particular, and begin to say that in these green zones, we need to make sure that businesses are given clear incentives to clean up and green up, because these are the places that are the most affected by pollution. I think in Los Angeles, we've also been very forward-looking about how do we take these opportunities and make them into job creation opportunities, so that we're not just sort of removing hazards, but creating good jobs in the emerging green industries around tree planting, urban conversion, retrofitting buildings, doing mass transit, doing development and housing around mass transit. When people think about climate change, it's often presented, and it should be, as a threat to the health of communities, a threat to our very existence as a species. But it's also an incredible opportunity, because if we decide that we want to confront this crisis, and the way that we want to confront this crisis is with courage and with boldness and with equity, then we know that we need to rapidly move to electric vehicles, and that could be a lot of good new jobs, and those jobs could be union jobs. Those jobs could have on-roads for communities of color, workers of color, to be able to get into that employment. When we know that we need to build mass transit, that's happening in Los Angeles, and there's a set of organizations called Slate Z around the layout of public transit in South LA that's trying to make sure that good jobs will be created, that housing will be there for low-income folks who've long lived there, that the process of gentrification won't force people out. We know that when we need to essentially redo our entire urban landscape, those are jobs. And so we need to move to a vision where we know that we're planting trees, not just because we want to protect residents, but because we want to create a model of the kind of jobs we want to generate and make available to low-income people of color.
Dr. Pastor shared with us the very real fears of urban renewal and urban greening leading to gentrification and the removal of people.
When I think about equity, I often insist that we conceptualize it with a time dimension, that it's about the past, the present, and the future. The past is about understanding the legacy of racism, of redlining that's created the urban landscape that we live with. And so thinking about reparations, really climate reparations, in terms of dealing with the disinvestment that's happened in communities of color. East Los Angeles, a place that got cut up by 6 different freeways, mauled over in the spirit of allowing commuters to come to downtown LA without having to live anywhere near Los Angeles. That's something that we have to do climate reparations for. That's the past. Of course, this level of disparity continues into the present, and we need to do something about it. But when I think about the present, I think about how do we ensure full participation of our communities in the design of our new green economy, in the design of urban greening, in the design of where we want to head. And when I think of the future, what I think of is how do we avoid what might be unintended but easily anticipated consequences. So, for example, when you green an area and you make it more attractive, or when you generate public transit and it makes it easier for someone to take public transit to where jobs might be, that makes an area, quote unquote, more desirable. It raises property values, and a lot of our communities that have struggled through the tough times find themselves pushed out by the good times because prices are going up, because rents wind up rising, because the commercial landscape changes and the taqueria gets replaced by a fancy vegan donut restaurant and it feels like it's no longer your neighborhood. Or in a place like South Los Angeles where you've got a lot of older black homeowners who their kids have left, the neighborhood has changed, and they can actually cash out and move to someplace nice with a nest egg. And so they're very tempted to sell their homes. And, you know, they're acting in their own best interest, but it can wind up really changing the character of a neighborhood. So how do we prevent that? We need to anticipate that it's going to happen. We need to create home ownership programs for particularly young people who come from the community, who want to be able to stay in the community, basically zero interest loans, lots of helps with down payment, etc., so that people can actually get a stake in the neighborhood. How do we create community land trust? Community land trust is where you basically buy up lots of housing or even lots of commercial property, and it's held by the community, and essentially that means that any improvement in the land value is going back to the community, but the rents can be held stable because the land is held in trust by the community. We also need to realize that part of the problem with rising rents is stagnant wages. And so one of the things we need to do in the neighborhoods where we think this is going to occur, how do we make sure that the workers who live there now are given the opportunity to connect to the best possible employment, particularly in this emerging green economy, so that they have the incomes to be able to afford rising rents? Again, you might say that these are unintended consequences, but they are totally anticipated consequences if you think about them, and there is so much we can do. The reason we don't do it is because there isn't sufficient political power to force this onto the agenda as development takes place. It's one of the reasons why I like to insist that, we can think a lot about projects that demonstrate what's possible. When we do an urban greening project, it shows what we can do in a neighborhood that's lacked trees. That projects help lead the way to policy that can make the possible standard operating procedure. So hopeful with the work that we're doing around urban greening, that it shows such positive public health impacts that the policy gets adopted, that we need to do this all over Los Angeles and indeed all over the United States in our urban areas that have too much impervious surface and not enough tree canopy. But we only change policy through power. That is, you have a lot of really good ideas that never get implemented because communities lack sufficient political power to make it happen. So it has to be the case that when we're doing these projects, we're thinking about how do we build community power and political voice to impact the policy process. Building power and getting involved in politics is an essential part of environmental justice.
Community land trusts have historically been used to keep land within community and family ownership. Dr. Pastor shares with us how exactly to create one.
Well, I'm a proud Angelino, which means I think we're doing so much right, even though I guess in a lot of ways we're getting some stuff wrong. I'll tell you, you're going to go visit in South Los Angeles, and one of the groups that's done a tremendous amount right there is on my sweatshirt, Community Coalition. Community Coalition does a lot of black-brown organizing so that in a neighborhood that went from being overwhelmingly African American to being majority Latino, building bridges so that people see their common interests, and also working on the issues that people care about. They care about urban greening, but they also care about the quality of schools. They care about gentrification. They care about the unhoused. And the way you build power is by beginning to go where people are and work with them on the issues that they care about. I also think that Los Angeles has done a great service by really trying to link up community groups with the power of labor unions, and labor unions in this area beginning to recognize the power of linking up with community groups. So a big sea change in Los Angeles was when the labor movement really linked up with the immigrant rights movement, recognizing that immigrants, including undocumented immigrants, were much more willing to join a union and to fight for their rights, and that led to a lot of labor community ties. I think another part of Los Angeles is that the early environmental justice movement here went from being neighborhood focused to being region-wide focused, realizing that the best way to protect what was going on in neighborhoods, the kind of injustice that was there, was to link up with other neighborhoods around the region and make common cause around trying to reduce freeway traffic, trying to get hazards out of our neighborhood, and most recently, trying to stop oil drilling, believe it or not, in the neighborhoods here in Los Angeles, and they've been successful in doing that. So I think that's another secret, is how do you move from neighborhood to region. I think the final thing I would highlight that Los Angeles, I think, has gotten right is how do you play an inside-outside game? How do you maintain the integrity of community organizers on the outside, fighting for change, recognizing that really it's community power and pressure that really leads to policy change, but how do you run people for office who can actually then become your allies on the inside? We're blessed to have a mayor that came from community organizing, was the co-founder of Community Coalition. She might not be getting everything right, but she's got an ear to community groups, and community groups recognize that even though she's our friend, she needs that pressure from community. She needs the calculus of power changing on the ground to make it possible for her to live up to her best aspirations. That was true of Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa as well. He actually also came from a movement background, and again, did some good things and had to be pressured to do some other things that were good. So I think that Los Angeles has done a pretty good job of understanding the inside-outside game with regard to political power and community organizing. We have so much to learn from other locations as well. The locations that have really tackled big oil in Texas and Louisiana, or at least tried to, and are involved in that fight. In the state of Washington, we've seen a lot of really interesting work being done around environment and linking together the environmental justice and climate change issues. And in general, just understanding also that what works here may not work in other locations. I mean, one of the things that I think is really interesting is how do you, in some locations, build ties with low-income whites? that can be really crucial in parts of the South and certainly in the Midwest. That's not as big a deal in Los Angeles, where putting together coalitions of communities of color can actually really wind up being something that you need to do to be able to get political power and make political change here. So I think we have a lot to show the rest of the country about what's possible, and we have a lot to learn about how to make sure that our lessons, if they are lessons, get applied in a way that actually makes sense for the local context.
Dr. Pastor talked to us about how community power and pressure leads to policy change, as well as the importance of the knowledge of indigenous and migrant communities.
Gosh, what we're finding around the state of California is that if you really wanted to prevent wildfires, you would go back to the burning practices of indigenous people in the state of California. And in fact, one of the sets of projects from the state has been turning over some of the forestry maintenance to indigenous folks who actually know how and when to burn and how and when to be in harmony. And I think that that's something that we're all really learning, is that the relationship that indigenous people have had to the land is a relationship of respect that actually we all need to take on and hang on to and make our own. And that indigenous people around the United States, around the world, certainly in California, are willing to share that. And really, when you think about the experience of a people who've experienced, and when you think about the experience of a people who've experienced genocide, have experienced the land being stolen away from them, and still are willing to share with the broader society that subjugated them these key lessons about how to respect the earth, how to live with nature, how to be a better caretaker of our planet and the climate. I think that's really something to take advantage of, to make links to celebrate. One of the things I think that people often don't connect between migration and the climate is how much of the current migration is actually being caused by climate crises around the world. You know, even the sort of northern triangle, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, a lot of what's forcing people to leave at this point is a combination of droughts and hurricanes, believe it or not, something that happens when you have an unstable climate as a result of climate change, is causing farmers to not be able to raise crops, is causing civil unrest and civil breakdown, and inducing people to take a long and arduous journey through Mexico to the border to try to make their way to the United States. That's happening in Africa as well, with people making a very long trek, sometimes to Europe, sometimes to the United States. It's happening all over the world. And if we do not address this climate crisis, we're going to get a lot more climate migration. And that's going to be something that we need to be dealing with. And so I think the connections between climate and migration are not often made. It's also the case, of course, that immigrants also bring us, there's a lot of indigenous immigrants that are coming from Latin America that also have a particular relationship with the land and nature and have a lot to teach us about how to live in better harmony. But we simply need to get a handle on the climate if we are to create the kind of situation. You know, people do not want to leave their homes. They leave their homes only when the threat of continuing to live there is so high because of economic lack of opportunity, because of political unrest, or because of climate change that's inducing the first two and simply making it inhospitable to continue to live in a location. Despite all that, the reason I have hope is that in this crisis of disconnection, I see a younger generation coming up that is really longing to do something around the climate, that recognizes the realities of racism and wants to form ties between different racial and ethnic groups, that thinks that this level of inequality is intolerable and has lost faith in our capitalist system to be able to address it, and is actively searching for something different. And I also have hope because I'm old enough to have seen movements like the emerging movements we see now that have analyzed the landscape, thought about the future, and laid out plans and projects to be able to build power and to change our politics. It's easy right now to understand or to not see the lack of progress we've made on LGBTQ rights. It's easy right now to not see the progress we've made on raising the issues around climate, which 40 years ago people were not paying much attention to at all. It's easy to not see the way that we've actually advanced in some ways, some receptivity toward immigrants, some shifts in anti-Black attitudes and the ability of people to find outlets, the recognition of the rights of Indigenous people. Progress is not enough, but we have made some. And the way that we empower movements is not by a sense of doom, but by a recognition of power and change and hope. And I have a lot of hope right now because against all these odds, there's a group of young activists who can tie together with older activists who are committed to changing the odds so that everyone has a chance to succeed and so that our planet has a chance to survive.